An Ontario judge handed former fashion giant Peter Nygard an 11-year prison sentence for 4 counts of sexual assault. Here's more from CBC's Jamie Strachan in Toronto.
Justice Robert Goldstein called disgraced fashion mogul Peter Nygard a sexual predator who used his position of power and wealth to take advantage of women, calling it a Canadian success story gone very wrong.
Justice Goldstein sentenced Mr. Nygard accordingly and found him to have committed these sexual assaults in a way that makes him, as we have been saying, recognizes the description of him as a sexual predator.
In the sentencing, the judge called Nygard a narcissist who felt entitled to do whatever he wanted. Nygard was convicted of sexually assaulting 4 women in the private bedroom of his Toronto fashion headquarters between the 1980s and mid-2000s. One was just 16. Victims advocate Shannon Moroney read a statement from one of the women.
We did this to ensure every victim of sexual assault will remember this trial and feel the strength and confidence to come forward and not be threatened by social status or money.
Dozens of women from around the world have alleged they were assaulted by Nygard. He faces charges in Manitoba, Quebec, and the United States. Some of those alleged victims were here in court for the sentencing.
Many of us have waited for this day for quite a few years. For me, I'm a 21-year survivor. I've been waiting for this day for 21 years.
The 83-year-old wore a black Canada Goose parka with a hood over his head, his bearded face shielded by a visor. He declined to address the court. The judge mostly rejected calls for leniency based on Nygard's age and failing health. Nygard's lawyer promises to appeal the conviction and the sentence.
So he's just going to continue to defend himself where he can, appeal where he can, and continue to maintain his innocence in all of these matters.
For Nygard, this marks the end of a stunning fall. Once a rich and powerful player in the fashion world, now likely to spend his final years in prison. Jamie Strachan, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, our guest for tonight's Spotlight has been investigating the Nygard case for over a decade. Timothy Sawa is an investigative journalist for the Fifth Estate and host of Evil by Design, the CBC's podcast series investigating Peter Nygard. Timothy, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
I think there's been a huge range of emotions, I think certainly for you over a decade now, but now looking at this sentencing, 11 years for 4 counts of sexual assault. Hearing that now, some level of conclusion maybe? What's going through your mind?
I mean, I don't know what is enough for what he has done to so many people. When I heard 11 years, my first reaction was, it's not enough, but I don't know if I would have had a reaction to any amount that would have sounded like enough, just given the amount of lives he's destroyed and the people he's, damaged for, impacted for forever. So,
I mean, I was in the courtroom a while back when we were expecting sentencing to come and listened to some of those victim impact statements. And one woman saying just in one day, her entire life has just been changed. It's been ruined. You have spoken to so many of these brave women. Talk to me a bit more about that, perhaps what your sense might be in terms of what they may be feeling right now, might be thinking?
I think that when he was charged initially and put behind bars, that was when the biggest sense of relief came, because he couldn't do it anymore.
Right.
And this will make sure that he can't do anything to anybody for at least the next 7 years. And there are more trials to come and more charges to be, that he's going to be tried for. So I think he's in his 80s, so there's probably a good chance that he won't see freedom for the rest of his life. And I think that is probably where the most sense of relief comes, that nobody else will have to deal with this. I think the other thing that happened today, which to me I think was significant, is his survivors have called him a sexual predator, the police have called him a sexual predator, journalists have called him, CBC has called him a sexual predator, but today a judge called him a sexual predator. I think that means something to people, and I certainly meant something to me to hear that. And
this goes on the record. This is in the books, as you point out, which is so critical. And in your years of investigating this, this was not just a extremely disturbing case, but it was in many ways risky for you. You faced, he sued you, I believe, at least once. Walk me through that a little bit, because, you know, there was, I guess, you've had an individual who felt they had so much power, they could do anything they could, as they've quashed so many journalists' voices in the past.
Yeah, that has been his MO, you know, for decades.
Yeah.
Whenever a journalist or even a woman or a member of his staff tries to hold him accountable for any of his behavior, he goes to the courts. And with his resources, he just, you know, he can out-court almost everybody, except, thankfully, the CBC. So when we started working on this case, and he has sued me and the CBC and my colleagues, I can't tell you how many times, 12. It's including criminally. We faced criminal charges, which were thrown out. Yeah, I mean, this has been his way. One of the ways he's kept the silence around him, around his behavior. And when we finally got involved over 10 years ago and he started launching lawsuits, the CBC said, you know, fine, bring it on.
Yeah.
And we're going to keep working on this, and we did.
And I think by doing that, you've really opened the door for other journalists, but I think for so many victims, whether you're talking about a Peter Nygard or others, and we know that there's many, many other cases as well that even don't get reported, women that may have recently been sexually assaulted and now perhaps feel some sense of righteousness to say that I can say something and I will have someone have my back. When we look at the damage that something like this can do, and in your research and conversations, so not just the damage to the victims, but we look at our legal system as well.
Yeah.
Give me a sense here of what we see that's gone wrong, but what we need to now pivot to make right.
I think that there's no doubt he abused the legal system and the justice system in his decades in trying to keep all of this silent, in particular in Manitoba. I think there are questions in Manitoba about the justice system and how they approached Peter Nygard. I mean, there were charges in Manitoba against him that the police said should be carried forward, and the prosecutors refused. There was an outside review of those charges, and one of those charges is now going ahead. But there are a lot of questions, in particular in Manitoba, about the justice system, and that's where we faced the majority of our charges.
Right.
Was in Manitoba. That's where he managed to get a criminal case launched against the CBC for criminal libel, and how that got as far as it did is an incredible feat, I think, but his money and his power and his influence in Manitoba, I think we're still starting to, you know, still figuring out how big that was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still charges in Manitoba, as you mentioned, also in Quebec, 9 charges, I believe, in New York. So those are all still cases that are pending and still need to happen there. You'll be following that. But I want to talk to you about your podcast as well. How in depth you got with that. It was a 9-part podcast series. Despite everything, despite you mentioned the number of lawsuits and whatnot, and I know threats and it is a scary situation. You still forged forward. Why?
I think it was the people who were talking to me and us at the CBC. I mean, it was the women who came forward. It was the whistleblowers who came forward inside his company. That's how this started. People from inside his company came to us and said, we can't believe what we're seeing. And they helped us at their own, you know, peril. And then the women who started to talk to us about what had happened to them. I mean, that is what kept us going. That is what, made us keep this going all these years, for sure.
And I know the work's not over yet, as we mentioned, those other cases, but brilliant work that you and the team have been doing over at Fifth Estate. Thank you so much for this, Timothy. We'll be following it and surely be having more conversations with you.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. That was the Fifth Estate's Timothy Sawa.